So hi and welcome everyone to today's session. I'm going to be sharing with you a slide with two images that will hopefully open up a discussion in a direction that we haven't, I think, touched on in our previous sessions. That is the role of photography in doing ethnography and in one's field's research. And I'm talking about photography as a research method, but also beyond that kind of sociological description. I'm also talking about photography as a material field through which one engages one's interlocutors and the place where one is working. And I want to ask for your reflections on your own engagements in your sites via cameras and via images, and about the things that you feel this afforded or perhaps this precluded. So if we look at the images, if you take a look on the left, I have a photograph of a man, Sifis, showing me a portrait of himself that I had taken some 10 years back in 2007 in my first field work in Sfakia, which I should say briefly, it's a mountainous and pastoral and tourist area in southern Crete, which is associated with ideas of ruggedness and tradition nationally and beyond. And on the right, another interlocutor, Yannis, is taking a photo with his mobile phone of a portrait of himself from that same 2007 series of portraits that I had taken. And the way the image is held up by his peer, which becomes his peer's face, and this, as an aside, speaks to an interesting issue of sameness in how this region has been historically represented by professionals as a whiskered man in black, which, however, at times photography has traces which destabilize that uniformity and which one can explore ethnographically. Now, there are various themes that these photos open up. First, there's an issue of scarcity and asymmetry, which has a greater prehistory in the region. Given there were no photographers locally, people depended historically on more privileged travelers with access to cameras in order to acquire images of themselves. And it is useful at a time of digital media proliferation to recall that access to cameras has been, for the greatest part of the medium's history, limited. And while one might think that societies like Sfakia would celebrate this opening afforded by the digital media, it's interesting also to note that many people prefer the black and white film photographs of the past, and they think that these images have a higher sort of position in the hierarchy of value, to do, of course, with their own stance and their own nostalgia towards the past. And second, there's an important component of ethnographic dynamics and affect here, which we could describe through anthropological themes of the gift, hospitality, reciprocity, and also warmth, participation in locals' lives, and so on. Thinking back, photography was, for me, a sort of way of capturing what I was doing and documenting the site, but it also became a way of supplying people with mementos of events, of rituals, of things that they came to cherish through the images. And it became a way for me to give back in response to what I perceived as people's openness to me. And my images from the first fieldwork period, which by now are considered historical by locals of the 2006-2007, acquired different values. Some of them have been reposted on Instagram. The most charged uses that I have seen concern their use in death rituals, as mementos in the houses of the deceased, in public spaces, and so on. And finally, there's productive tension I want to raise here. While I set out to research how the area is represented at the interstice of the local and the more than local, at the same time, I've been simultaneously involved in producing and circulating such representations. And I have used some of my experiences from the field of exchanging images and producing images, to actually think about what happens when, say, tourists from the 60s return their own images to their original hosts, or the kinds of responses that locals have vis-a-vis outsiders with cameras, or the role of cameras as devices that mitigate certain tensions, affording inclusions, creating a sense of thankfulness and participation in locals' lives, and exploring locals' ideas of what is worth capturing and what is worth omitting. So I'll stop with this and open it up to your thoughts and ideas.
Yeah, I wanted to ask Kostis about, obviously both images show people posing with photographs. for your camera, but I'm curious about what happened before that. I mean, how they posed for your camera when the initial image was made. And I suppose, you know, what I'm thinking of is my own experiences in India over many decades of kind of collaboration or encounter with subjects of portraiture, in which, you know, well, my own experience has been at least two different agendas often working against each other, or the one being overridden by the other. So I mean, obviously photography is in some sense inherently collaborative. So I was curious to know more about your encounters with these subjects before or during, while the image was being made.
The particular black and white portrait series, I took them at the very end of my first field work, after a year I had spent in the village. And that's also another interesting issue, that people let themselves or got involved in this idea of producing a portrait of themselves only after a certain amount of time had been spent. So they were very keen on me taking their portraits, which I had described, and they knew from my past photographic work that it would be black and white in film. They were very keen. I think they were kind of anticipating the result. So they were very keen on getting involved. And when I started circulating these images, it sort of satisfied their expectation that this would be the kind of black and white, serious, grand portraiture of themselves that they had hoped I would produce. And that's how these images ended up in some sort of mortuary sites and so on. So
what expectation did they already have about how they should be represented? I mean, how did they present themselves to the camera is I suppose what I'm interested in.
I think in that particular society, it's a sort of very like an interesting juxtaposition to the Indian example that you have been discussing, i.e. people think that photography in a portrait context would have to capture their absolute sort of one essence of what they are. And this, of course, ties with that society's particular general essentialism, i.e. the search for a pure one unique essence, which has to do with a lot of things. It has to do with their own ideas of what tradition is, what the past was, and so on. So photography becomes a technology of capturing that one essence. And black and white photography of the film era is preferred partly because it's seen as the ideal medium of capturing that one the one historical epoch and the one essence.
Something that just occurred to me, and this is based on my experience photographing, taking pictures of interlocutors in Nicaragua, but also in Guatemala, it was that every time I asked someone to pose for a portrait, or, I offered to take someone's portrait, people would kind of ask for another encounter where they would be able to prepare, both in terms of their appearance, sometimes cut their hair, and prepare the space. And what ended up happening was that actually a few of the portraits I have from Guatemala, I was doing field work in a Mayan village on Lake Atitlan, and it was actually incredible. These were portraits of I was taking pictures of photographers, and it was really incredible how they set up the space in a way where, it was very, they knew what I would be looking at, right, as photographers themselves. So they basically set up the picture for me. They created the picture for me before I even took it, if that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense in an Indian context. Yeah. So it's essentially a kind of renegotiation by the subjects of picture making on their own terms. I mean, one could maybe also think of it as where their aesthetics becomes an ethics and politics asserted by them.
Of course, their aesthetics also breaks down along gender and other lines, i.e. different responses in staging oneself by women and by men and by age groups.
Yeah, I was also, when it comes to aesthetics, the photographers, the elder studio photographers whose portrait I did take was, all of them talked about that amorphous global audience, the fact that the photograph was going to go somewhere beyond Nigeria. So they had an idea about being received by that audience. And it's quite interesting because I brought back the articles because once I got into the field, I found out that they'd never actually seen the Sprague articles. So I did copies for each of the elder photographers who had survived, and they all were telling stories about themselves and almost speaking to their younger self, and always referring to that photograph as my younger self, and sort of telling that younger self the life they're living now. I don't know if your interlocutors also had that dynamic with the images as well, which kind of collapsed time in an interesting way.
Yes, I mean, what resonates a lot with what you said is that sense of address, the mode of address, and the idea of photography as something that goes to a wider audience. So creating a perception. And I think in that particular society that I've been working on in Sfakia, people have had that perception partly because of the presence of so many photographers historically and folklorists and others, i.e. a heightened sense of oneself through the idea that someone is representing oneself. But there are interesting sort of plays of temporality when people look at images and when they are referring to themselves, and especially when they're looking at their ancestors, patrilineal especially. So ideas of kinship and the patriline as being one unity are very often performed when looking at photographs and referring to one's great-grandfather as a sort of extension of oneself in the present.
So how does this connection between historicity and media and aesthetics carry into, say, Instagram, you know, where different filters would give you the potential to mimic and reinvigorate that historicized space?
I think it's something that we are yet to see, of course, because this is unraveling as we speak. But overall, in light of what I said about nostalgia and about essentialism, I think there's a clear distinction in my interlocutors' minds about the real historicity of historical photographs, which capture the history age capital, and the kind of plays and tricks that digital technology affords today, which they might enjoy or find amusing, but it cannot compare to what they think that the film sort of real sepia of the past is, the real black and white. So I think there's a clear distinction between film as the agent of the historical capital age and everything else that is just a trick or an amusing sort of play on what the past can look like.
So interesting, Kostis, because it makes me think also that there's an element of monumentalizing in here, choosing a very specific type of image, so portrait, and also usually with a lot of kind of contingent elements removed. And I feel like Instagram just simply doesn't allow that. I mean, of course, you could curate that Instagram, but in general, as most people use the platform, it's just a flurry of images from your everyday life. So I feel like that technology in itself, or that frame in itself, kind of precludes the type of monumentalizing that I think is happening in the examples that you're showing.
I think what I'm showing has parallels with a lot of your work that you've done with studios. I mean, Sfakia was a rural region without a studio, and people did visit studios in the cities, but all of these photographs that have ended up in their households by the travelers and the folklorists essentially do play a role of monumentalizing, as you say, in the absence of a sort of permanent studio where people would visit, as in your field sites. I think there's lots of parallels there.
But I was also going to say that what I found interesting in terms of, Chris, what you said about the digital, is that almost what the photographer was able to do in the darkroom in the analog era, for example, like with the Sprague double exposures of the Ibeji photographs. So there's always, it is a precursor to what is now being done in the digital. So there's still that expectation that the photographer will make you come out better or will bring the family together. So taking photographs of different portraits of family members who've migrated overseas or to other parts of Africa or Nigeria, and bringing them together in a group photograph, for example, to commemorate an important anniversary. So it's still that's before it was being done manually by the photographer in the darkroom, but now it's done through the digital. But still that the work that the photograph does in terms of that, again, not just collapsing time, but also space. So even in the analog era, there was that expectation that now is in the digital era. Except for the photographers, the elder studio photographers, they do feel that there's an element of care and work that they were able to do in the actual doing of the work with their hands, that they feel that the digital doesn't do.
Well, it rings all kinds of bells, especially in a Nepali context, in high out migration areas where photography, as you very well put it, offers spatial compression or kind of spatial perfection. It offers the possibility of reuniting persons who are otherwise separated. But I think that probably reflects pretty much the specific migration histories of different areas. So that's not something that's especially marked in central India. I felt that probably for the editor's purpose, it would be good to end after Nalu's previous comment. But Vindhya, did you want to add anything before we wrap up?
I mean, I echo what Nalu said, in the sense that many of the things that happen by way of Photoshop are things that are replicating what photographers used to do with, scissors and paste and, color tinting and so on as well. But I think with the digital, what's interesting is also that the kind of image sharing platforms are now moving towards animated images and video as opposed to still image, right? And with a lot of the kind of re-photographing and uploading of old family photographs is now moving into the kind of AI terrain of how do you reanimate the old family photograph to make your grandmother look like she was alive, or things like that. So I think the speed at which these platforms are moving is also interesting, and I think what that means for how an image is sort of framed and perceived is also fascinating. And I see the kind of AI stuff catching on with some of the kind of older portraits of people involved in the Tamil militancy, for example, which are now being kind of revived through MyHeritage and other kind of AI adaptations. So it's interesting to see how that will catch on as well, because when you look at them, they are very much studio images that have been overpainted and kind of carry with them a set of what might now be day-to-day aesthetics, but are then kind of digitally reinvigorated in a sense. So yeah, that's what I was thinking in response to, I think, Nalu's comment in particular, but also how these images then recirculate and are kind of conjugated for the kinds of sharing technologies as opposed to the making technologies, if that makes sense.
Chris, if I may, given your long-term experience in Central India of doing fieldwork, is your sense that your sort of historical role in the region, is there an expectation of you that you produce sort of visual images of the past, of the area of Nagda, sort of you as a kind of holder of historical material because of the long-term relationship via camera?
No, I think is the answer to that. I mean, I find your examples today fascinating because they suggest such a marked contrast with Indian practice. So in central India, I mean, I could potentially talk about this in the next session with an image that counterpoints to the ones you've shown here today. But there's this, what I call anti-patina. So memorial photographs are continually upgraded every couple of years, photoshopped in ways that detach them further and further from their original historical reference. So there's very little interest in monumentality or preserving the pure initial indexical moment. The photographic image is a starting point for endless revision. So I think people are looking for aesthetic effects, for brilliance, wonder, power, rather than any kind of documentary claim. So it's a very different scenario to what you're describing for Greece. But maybe I could talk about one of those images in the next session.